I am a member of the board of the Royall House Slave Quarters. We're delighted that so many of you have tuned in this afternoon for our first virtual coffee and conversation event. Thank you for welcoming us into your homes. In the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, it's extra special to celebrate good news. This spring, the Royall House Slave Quarters welcomed our new Executive Director, Kyera Singleton. We're now thrilled to be able to introduce her to all of you today. She and all of us look forward to when we are able to meet her in person. We'll proceed as follows. Kyera and I will engage in a conversation, and she will then answer your questions. To submit a question, please type it using the question function. Please note that this is the only way you'll be able to ask a question. Kyera will answer as many questions as time permits. Today's event is being recorded and will be posted on our new YouTube channel. A link will be provided in our June e-newsletter. We encourage each of you to share news of Kyera's arrival with your own networks. Let's get started. Welcome, Kyera.
Hi. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to meet you, although I'm meeting you virtually. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation.
Kyera, you've been on the job since late March, and of course, you've arrived during a most unusual time. Please share with us your impressions of the Royall House Slave Quarters so far.
I think just to start us off, one of the most exciting things about starting in March was that I actually had an opportunity to really kind of like learn as I go. Grace Law, Peter, MK, Lucia, you, so many other people have been very, very helpful throughout this entire process. And that's been really, really great. It's felt like a team effort. People have had patience with me as I figure out what does it mean to be an executive director, and I learn new skills. And as we try to think about what these next few months look like for all of us, but also for the future of the museum. So it's been obviously a really strange time to start, but one that has been filled with a lot of hope, and one that's been filled with a lot of exciting challenges. One of the first things that happened when I started the position was I received an email that was like, do you want to
Welcome. And sorry that we're starting a few minutes late. I guess we had a minor technical glitch. My name is Barbara Berenson, and I am and many of you have tuned in this afternoon for our very first virtual coffee and conversation event. Thank you for welcoming us into your home. In the midst of this coronavirus pandemic, it's extra special to have good news to celebrate. This spring, the Royall House Slave Quarters welcomed our new Executive Director, Kyera Singleton. We're now thrilled to be able to introduce her to all of you today. She and all of us look forward to when you are able to meet her in person. We'll proceed as follows today. Kyera and I will engage in a conversation, and she will then answer your questions. To submit a question, please type it using the question function. Please note that this will be the only way to ask a question. Kyera will answer as many questions as time permits. Today's event is being recorded and will be posted on our new YouTube channel. A link will be provided in the June newsletter. We encourage each of you to share news of Kyera's arrival with your own networks. Let's get started. Welcome, Kyera.
Hi, Barbara, and hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. I'm delighted to virtually meet you all. I know that's not an ideal situation, but we're really, really excited that so many of you are taking an hour out of your day to join us.
So Kyera, you've been on the job since late March, and of course, it's been a most unusual time. Please tell us about your first weeks and share with us your impressions of the Royall House Slave Quarters thus far.
I think to just get started that so far at the Royall House and Slave Quarters, I've had a really, really amazing welcome from everyone, from the board members, from members who have actually emailed me to just like tell me how excited they are, different community members from different museums, both in the state and out of state, have emailed me to talk about future collaborations and also to talk about how much they look up to the Royall House and Slave Quarters. So it's actually been a really, really exciting time for me as I'm, learning how to be an executive director, but also getting to know this wonderful community that exists of individuals who are committed to telling the history of slavery. And so far, it's been going really great. I've had a lot of support, which is really amazing, because as many of you know, this is my first time in a role like this. And so I've had a lot of support from people like Grace Law, from Peter, who's co-president, Lucia, who's helped, and MK, who does a lot of the tech stuff. So it's been a team effort. And one of the, I guess I'll share a funny highlight of my first weeks on the job. I started and, I'm like learning new things. I'm having conversations with people every week. And then I get an email that's like, hey, we're actually signed up to be the keynote speaker at the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire's annual tour training. And the person who was supposed to be the keynote is no longer with us. So can you do it? And in that moment, I was like, me? I'm gonna I'm gonna do this. And so I immediately said sure and emailed our education coordinator, Denise, and asked her if she wanted to do it with me. And so we pulled together a presentation and we made it happen. And one of the amazing moments in that conversation was actually having people tell me about their first moments encountering the Royall House and Slave Quarters. And a lot of it had to do with going to the website or hearing about it and having the experience of knowing that slavery was central to the museum and how they talked about its history. And from a lot of the smaller house museums, not only in New England, but around the country, from the ones that have emailed me, they've actually really, really found the Royall House and Slave Quarters to be very inspiring, because we're not necessarily kind of making, the history of slavery as, an aside. You don't go through a tour and then you're like, oh yes, by the way, enslaved people lived here, but it's actually central to understanding New England slavery, but also how the royal family built their wealth. So it's been very quick. I've been learning a lot of new things quickly, but I'm having a great time doing so.
Well, you have certainly hit the ground running, and that is a wonderful story. Why don't we turn to the journey that brought you to us? And we are so happy that we are the next step on your journey. Can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and went to school, and what first sparked some of your interest in history and the history of slavery?
Yeah, so I grew up in a place called Camden, New Jersey, and I moved to another town called Cherry Hill when I was around 5th grade, and I finished my schooling there. And then I went to college at McAllister College, which is actually very interesting because the former executive director, Tom, also went to McAllister College. So, I like to think that this was fate and this was meant to be. And so I would say that my interest really in thinking about slavery and museums actually started quite early when I was young. During the summers, I would always go to Baltimore and go to the harbor. And my aunt once took us to a museum called the Black Wax Museum in Baltimore. And it was the first time that I ever went into a museum space that had a section dedicated to slavery. And when you go into the museum, you go under and they simulate a slave ship. And that was really the first time that I ever thought about what does it mean to kind of represent slavery in a museum space. And then as I got older, I went back, and so my questions developed. And when I got to college was a space for me when I started to read more, and I started to think more critically about what kind of scholar I wanted to be. I joined a fellowship called the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Research Program, and I decided I was going to study slavery. And that's kind of how my interest academically started. I started off working on slavery in New Orleans, and as my project advanced and then I got into graduate school, that shifted and I started to look at slavery in the Upper South. But throughout all of that, my commitment has always been to thinking about how enslaved women are impacted and how their stories are told or not told.
Well, I know that leads us directly to the fascinating subject of your dissertation, which I know you are close to completing. Can you tell us a little bit about the subject of your doctoral dissertation?
Yes, so my dissertation is called Containing Women, and it looks at the ways in which Black women navigated the institution of slavery and also the rise of carceral institutions in the 19th century. And one of the founding kind of questions of my dissertation is to really think about how enslaved people experience both slavery and incarceration. And one of the things that I started to think about more broadly was that the literature tells us that most Black people aren't really in prisons and jails until post 1865. And a part of my dissertation wanted to trouble that by asking us to think critically about what do we mean when we talk about the South. Now, if we're talking about Mississippi, that's very true in many ways. But if we're talking about Maryland or if we're talking about Virginia, it's the opposite. And then from there, I started to have a conversation about, where are the Black women? Where are enslaved and free Black women if they're not always in spaces like the penitentiary? Maybe they're in work homes, or maybe, they're in local jails. And from there, I started to put together a dissertation that looks at a variety of spaces and places that enslaved women kind of move in and out as they trouble what freedom means in the 19th century, context.
I can't wait to be able to read it. Can you tell us about some of the very interesting places you have gone to do research for your dissertation?
Most of my research has taken place in Maryland. So I've done a lot of work in Annapolis, Maryland at the State Archives. I've done work in Baltimore at the Baltimore City Archives. I've done some work in DC at the National Archives, Library of Congress. I've also done some work in Philadelphia at the Library Company of Philadelphia. And so all of those places, they have a wealth of resources in terms of not only slavery records, but also just large collections of African American of history.
Well, you come to us with a background not only in academia, but also in both the museum world and the political world, and I'd love to explore those. Can you start by telling us something about your work at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, Michigan?
Yeah, so early on in my graduate school career, the University of Michigan, they have a program that is geared towards getting PhD students into different forms of public history. And so I applied for one of those fellowships, and I was paired with the Charles Wright Museum. And when I got there, it was interesting because I didn't know quite what I was going to do. I was like, oh, am I going to work in terms of helping with the curatorial team? Like, what actually am I going to do? And it was really awesome because they gave us an opportunity to do a lot of different things. And I chose to work on a project called a project that was about the Civil War. And that project was basically documenting the Black experience during the Civil War and really trying to move the narrative from, a war history and focusing only on, major battles, but also really thinking about kind of what did life look like for Black women, men, and children during the war, and how can we broaden this story out a bit more. And so I was able to write different scripts that were then turned into documentary shorts that are currently still on their website. That project started before me and also continued after me. So it was really exciting to work with a bunch of people. Some were graduate students that I knew who had did it the summer before me, and then others were graduate students that I knew who did it the summers after me. And so it was a really exciting project in which I also was able to learn a lot about the Civil War and also a lot about kind of these hidden histories. So that was mostly my work at the Charles Wright Museum. And then I also got to work on a really exciting project that's still up if you go to the museum, and it's their permanent timeline of African American history. And I basically helped choose events, and I wrote different descriptions for that. And that was really fun to think about what goes in and what do we leave out? How do we tell the narrative on a timeline?
Those sound like fabulous projects, and we look forward to seeing new incarnations of those or similar things at the Royall House. In addition to the past, you've also had a lot of work on present social justice issues.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work when you were at the ACLU in Georgia?
Yeah, so I spent a year at the ACLU in Georgia working as a policy fellow under Andrea Young, who is the executive director there, and also Christopher Bruce, who is the political director. And I had the really awesome and unique opportunity to be on the ground and do a lot of hands-on work. And so some of the work that I did was a lot of research. I worked on issues of mass incarceration, focusing on women and girls in the state. But then I also did work on voting rights, and then I also did work on reproductive justice. And so some of the amazing projects that I got to participate in, I guess I'll do one. My favorite aspect of the job was during the legislative session. Before starting at the ACLU, I knew about the legislative session, never been to the Capitol, definitely hadn't been there every single day. And so I jumped right in, and I was basically at the Capitol every single day, helping the team work on different issues. And because of that, I had the opportunity to testify in front of the Senate for the Dignity Bill, which is a project that we worked on, which was to stop the shackling of pregnant women in prison facilities across the state. And that was a really surreal experience, because you got to see the ways in which a bill gets passed. And that was not something I ever had experience in. And so you have to learn how to communicate with people across the aisles, and you have to learn how to also step back and listen. And so those were the type of projects that I worked on at the ACLU, very much so community centered, but also geared towards my background as a researcher.
So just in these few minutes, we've heard about so many different diverse aspects of your background: academia, museum work, political work. Are there any key lessons or common themes that you've taken from these diverse experiences?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think one of the key lessons for me has always been to think about how does history shape our current moment? How can we think about lessons from the past to understand current moments? And that's not to say to, draw direct linear, lines between the two, but I think in a lot of ways, the work that I do is very concerned with how to illuminate tough issues and make them approachable and make them accessible. And that's what I do in my own work, but that's also what I've done in each opportunity that I've had, is like, what does it mean to do the work that I do if people can't readily access it? And so for me, the working in the public humanities has been a step to make that work very accessible. And from the different opportunities, I've learned how to do that. I wasn't always the best at doing that, because you go in, you're used to sitting down reading books, and then someone asks you to translate that knowledge. for a room full of people and make sure not only that you go in with the knowledge that you have, but also to listen, because a lot of the times people are already saying the things that I've learned in books, right? And so how can I then have a conversation, and what can I not only leave, but what can I take away? You know, it's always a learning process. And so I think for me, I've just been really lucky to be around a lot of great people who have taught me a lot of things. And so I think the biggest lesson for me has been, what does it mean to kind of translate the work that I do for a broader community, while at the same time listening to that community and asking them, how can I help? How can I be of service to the work that they're already doing? And how can I amplify it in my position?
Well, what a stupendous answer. And it leads directly to my next question, which is, what attracted you to apply for the position of Executive Director of the Royall House and Slave Quarters?
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, I had no idea that the Royall House and Slave Quarters existed. When I initially came to the area for the first time, I came here in the summer of 2019 for a conference, the Little Berkshires, that was at Harvard at the time. And while I was listening to a presentation from Dr. Kendra Fields, who's at Tufts, she encouraged all of us to go check out the Royall House and Slave Quarters. And I'm from New Jersey and I study slavery. So when she said it was the only standing slave quarters, I said, there are standing slave quarters in the North? And I immediately was like, no. And then, well, obviously, why would she lie? But I immediately took out my phone and looked, and I was like, wow. And my friends and I, we went on a tour. And in that moment, I think I was overwhelmed, because not because I didn't know about it, but because the way that the lives of the enslaved women and men and children were so richly intertwined into the tour, at every single aspect of it, it really left a really huge mark on me. And then I left, I knew it was there. I figured maybe I would return, for some events. But then my advisor emailed me about this job posting and basically told me to stop what I was doing and apply. And so I did that. And then I ended up here. But one of the things that led me to it was that I was just really, really fascinated by the way in which the museum has done so much amazing work to get this history right and to tell the story. And also, when I interviewed, everyone was so amazing and welcoming and open to any ideas to keep, to push the story forward, to also to build, new membership for the museum, and to basically have every single person, possible know about it. And so I'm just really excited to, be a part of a team that cares about, the history of slavery as much as I do, and also cares about disrupting, myths, and also pushing back against narratives that say, still today, that, slavery is, an institution that mostly, is understood through the South, and really being bold about its, ties to the North. And not only that, it existed, but it was fundamental to the economy. And then furthermore, asking tough questions about how do you tell the lives of the enslaved women, men, and children who lived and worked, on the farm, when we don't have as many records. And those are like some of the questions that I'm deeply invested in, is how do you make that history come alive? And so, yeah, I was just excited about the work that was being done, and I was ready to just jump in.
Well, we are so happy to have you here. I know you've touched upon this in some of your answers, but are you able to answer a question? What are some of the things that you really hope to accomplish during your tenure at the Royall House and Slave Quarters?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I really want to accomplish is to actually kind of just like make the museum a bit more visible, right? Already amazing things have been happening, and everyone has worked so hard. And I think that there's, more things to be done in that way. I think making sure that more people come, more people, know that it exists, more people are excited about the work that we're doing and know about the work that we're doing and look forward to the programming that we're doing. I think that that's, really, really crucial, and specifically reaching out to communities that haven't necessarily gone to the Royall House, so really thinking about communities of color throughout the state, really trying to get more students of color, specifically, Black students, through the Royall House. I think it's really, really important that that happens, and just connecting more with the local institutions. There's already been a lot of collaborations, and I really just want to strengthen those collaborations. And from my conversations with the different museums for the Trail project, that's been really, really exciting, and people want to collaborate more. And I think this is an exciting time to start that. So I think that that's one of my major points that I want to emphasize, is thinking about the visibility and accessibility of this museum. I think, what is the point of having this amazing history if not everyone has access to it? And I think that what's already been done is great in terms of subsidizing schools to make sure that children can get there. And I think I'm just excited to push that forward a little bit more. I think the other major thing that I want to accomplish while at the museum is really trying to do more work about the enslaved people who lived and worked there. I think as a researcher, I'm in a unique opportunity because, I want to do the research and I can do the research, but there's also, amazing collaborations that have already been happening between Tufts and Harvard. And so I'm really excited to learn more about what's already going on and, jump in and see how I can help that and push those projects forward. And also making more connections between how, slavery impacts current conditions today. So really, when people leave the museum, they understand that, the institution of slavery has, impacts communities of color, Black communities in particular today, in all of these different ways. And that a part of our job is not only to tell the story of the past, but to think about how it has impacted our future.
Well, it's great to have so many wonderful things to look forward to. I know it's not possible these days to talk about museums and house museums without talking about challenges also. What are some of the biggest challenges that you anticipate facing?
Well, I think some of the conversations that I've been privy to in terms of, what house museums are really worried about is, how do you come back after, being closed for so long? And so that's going to be an interesting conversation to have. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about is how to keep our public engaged with the work that we've been doing while the museum is closed, and how to make sure that people don't necessarily forget about us. And so some of the online programming that we're working on, I think will be really exciting coming up. And so I hope to tell you more about that as we solidify plans, but we should have a concert coming up, hopefully in June. We've been working on that, and so just waiting to finalize details. And I think just being able to put out content that makes people feel good, and also that makes people realize that, even with the challenges, we're still trying to do the work in the best way that we can, and that we're committed to doing that work.
Well, obviously you have given great answers because among other things, we have a number of people who have been typing away questions. So why don't we pause our conversation and let's include some of our members and volunteers and listeners. And I'll start by reading some of the questions that have come in. And by the way, those of you who have questions, this is a great time to type them in. So the first question is, I have enjoyed attending speaker events at the Royall House in the past few years. What are some of your ideas for programming?
Yeah, so that's great. So I think for me, some of the speakers that I would like to welcome to the museum, if possible, would have to do a lot with kind of some of the local people who are here. So they're amazing. They're amazing, poets in the area who I think would be really, really great. And also they have this amazing following all throughout the city. And so those are some of the like programming ideas that I think would be really great, is to have different people kind of come in and, you know, do their work, but also use our space in order to do that. And so that's some of the programming ideas that I have, just kind of connected to local arts communities in general. I think some of the other programming ideas that I have is new books that have come out. We've spoken about a few of these ideas, but doing actually a series or doing a book talk about mass incarceration. And there's some really great speakers who I would want to bring in for that, if possible. Also kind of thinking about the conversation about slavery and suffrage. So obviously, Martha Jones has an amazing book coming out about the suffrage movement, and I think she would be someone who would be really great to try to bring into the museum as well. And so I think some of the speakers will obviously be about how can we not only talk about our content, but think broader about our content, right? And think about how kind of slavery kind of impacts these different aspects of history, and kind of broadening the programming a little bit.
So wonderful ideas, so exciting. This next question asks about your thoughts with a whole other audience, which is school children. So I'm going to read you this whole question. It's from a teacher who says, "I can't wait to come visit with my fifth graders. Through remote learning, I am having my students learn about enslaved people and slavery in the North, and we are reading Freedom Over Me. I'm really looking forward to making more connections with the Royall House Slave Quarters. We will be working on our social studies curriculum as a district." This is a teacher from Somerville. "Would you be interested in working with us a bit when we get started?"
Yes, that is great. And actually, someone who I can connect you to is our education coordinator, who's already working on some curriculum, which is really exciting. And I think that that would be a really great, you know, conversation between the two of you. But also, I would obviously love to help and to, you know, help in any way possible. Because Denise has been working on the curriculum, I've been looking it over and thinking critically about what does it mean to create curriculum around slavery, and to talk about enslavement and enslaved people, and make sure that, you know, students walk away not only thinking that, you know, yes, slavery was bad, but also to really, you know, unpack the nuances without, you know, being off-putting, but at the same time with making sure that they're understanding all that there is to understand about slavery. So we've been having, I guess we're going to have some more conversations about that. And so, yes, to answer your question, I would be delighted.
If my eyes look like they're wandering, for those of you who are watching, as I'm looking at my other monitor to read some of the questions that are coming in, that keep popping up. And I'll get to as many as I can. We're not going to, unfortunately, be able to reach every question, I don't think. Here is a question that says, "How do you hope to use the museum to help people face racism and the legacy of slavery in Massachusetts and the North?"
It's a really good question. So I think one of the important aspects of the work that we do at the museum is not only to tell this history, but to also think about the larger connection to the North, and how slavery was a vital, you know, component of the economy, right? That it wasn't just something that happened and some people participated, but like it was actually really, really important to the economy. And I think that one of the ways that we can do that work and tie it to how it has impacted marginalized communities is to think quite broadly about, you know, some issues that we know today. We can talk about health disparities in marginalized communities and how that relates, you know, to a lack of medical care and how that has roots in enslavement. We can talk about, you know, housing discrimination and education, you know, disparities. We can talk quite frankly about mass incarceration and police brutality and over policing of communities, mostly Black communities, communities of color, right? And so obviously the work that we do is not necessarily, you know, you're not going to come in and see a full-blown exhibit on one of those issues, but I think it's up to us to kind of create the link and bridge to those conversations. And I'm really excited to do that through not only programming, but also using our Facebook and our Twitter and our Instagram and our website to kind of highlight what people are also already doing in Boston, and creating partnerships to kind of work on those issues together.
So much exciting news. We do have a few questions, not surprisingly, related specifically to the pandemic. So a few people wanted to drill down into that a bit and ask, how will the health crisis impact the running and outreach at the Royall House and Slave Quarters?
Can you repeat that question for me, Barbara?
Yes, sorry. People want to know, how will the current pandemic impact the running and outreach at the Royall House and Slave Quarters?
Yeah. So we're figuring that out, just like everyone else. And right now, I think that what we've tried to do is, like, we're trying to do as much outreach as possible and online that we can, and build partnerships in as many ways that we can, and kind of make sure that we're staying in touch with our members, and, you know, also trying to get new people on board as well. And so really, I don't think we have a concrete answer about how it's really going to impact us. We're kind of learning as we go, but what we're not letting the pandemic do is completely slow us down. So we're trying to do as much as we can using, you know, an online platform as possible. And I think that as we learn more about the extent of how long the museum will have to be closed during the pandemic, I think that, you know, we'll have a better answer for how it's going to impact outreach and programming and planning. But as of right now, we're trying to, you know, we're trying to just move forward. And Denise is hard at work trying to work with different school teachers and building a curriculum that is created from this Royall House. And I'm hard at work trying to think about the different ways to create programming and to kind of continue to grow the museum as much as possible.
Thank you. The next question picks up specifically on your comments about visibility for the Royall House and partnerships, like your discussion of the New Hampshire African American Trail. And this member asks, how might the Royall House connect with the National Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., the International African American Museum in Charleston, and other museums?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think right now, one of our main goals is to work, to do as much work as we can locally. And I think building up the partnerships here first is more of a priority. But I think as we do that, obviously reaching out to different museums nationally is at the top of the list. And one of the things that I've heard from different people who have written to us is ideas about thinking through collaborations, thinking with other house museums and maybe even larger museums like the National Museum of African American History, is to try to have more of this work highlighted that we're doing, not only in their exhibits. I know some of that is already there with the National Museum, but thinking about broader programming so that, you know, we can all use both of our audiences to kind of educate the larger public about what we're doing, since most people probably, you know, writ large aren't as aware of us. So it's a really good question, and I think it's one that I'm interested in exploring. And I think some of that can quite honestly start with some online programming and conversations, maybe reaching out to some curators and having them have a conversation with us. That could be some of the, you know, the next coffee and conversation, thinking about kind of how to tell, you know, the history of, you know, how to, like, you know, curate exhibits on African American history, and what are the stakes of having, you know, difficult conversations, and what are the stakes of having, you know, what are the stakes of having conversations that let us know that museums are not neutral, and what are our responsibility? What is our responsibility as a museum to kind of push that forward?
We still keep getting more questions. We probably have time for a couple more, if that's okay with you, Kyera. One asks about the best ways to tell the story of the Royall House to show that the Royals could not have survived without the labor of the enslaved Africans in many different areas, not just agriculture, but also health, construction, crafts, and so on.
Sorry, Barbara, you broke up a little bit. Can you repeat
Oh, I'm
that for
sorry.
me?
I hope sorry about that. Let me just find that one. Oh, this is from a visitor or a member who wants to know what ideas you have. Can you hear me okay now? To show how the Royals could not have survived without the enslaved Africans on their site, not just in the world of agriculture, but also in many other economic arenas like health, construction, crafts, and so on.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think part of doing that work has been the museum has already started to do that work, and I think a lot of that is kind of seen through looking at the different trade that the Royals are doing, right? And so this is on my mind because I was just reading one of the lesson plans that Denise has been constructing. But Jacob Royall is a dry goods merchant, right? And who is not only advertising, different goods for sale, but also simultaneously advertising enslaved people, right? So that's a big part of his business. It's not, separate, it's intertwined. And I think highlighting more of that. So going back to the primary sources and, doing a good job at showcasing that work to let people know that, the royal family did not just have enslaved people on the farm, helping to make their life, easy and enriching themselves, through free labor, forced, free labor, right? But also that they were a part of the trade, they were a part of the they were part of the triangular trade in which goods are moving, between the Americas and the Caribbean and Africa, right? And I think that that's really, really important.
Well, I think this may be our last question. A couple of people have picked up on your enthusiasm, your big plans, and so forth, to basically offer you a question that says, what are your biggest dreams? Which in a world where we're all feeling limited and challenged, it's wonderful for people to say, what are your biggest dreams that you might have for the Royall House and Slave Quarters? Very forward looking.
Wow, that's a really good question. I feel like I have a lot of dreams. So my biggest dreams, I think, for me, I think my biggest dream would be to have more people who look like me coming into the museum. I think the experience that I felt when I went in the first time was very special. And I know the group of friends that I was with had the same experience. And I think, we would do a disservice, to the public to be there and not, have as many, Black students of color to come through those doors, right? And also to see like what doing the work really looks like, to see what a museum who's committed to centering the lives of enslaved people look like. And I think that that's one of my biggest dreams is to make it, as more accessible for Black communities of color, and to have students have an experience of learning about this history and feel proud to know that an institution is taking it seriously.
Well, Kyera, I am certain that every single person who has tuned in today is extremely eager to have a chance to meet you in person and to see all the wonderful work that you plan to do. Thank you so much for becoming the Executive Director of the Royall House and Slave Quarters. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Please remember that today's event has been recorded and will be posted soon on our new YouTube channel. And a link will be provided in the June e-newsletter. And as I said at the beginning, we encourage you to share news of this event with your networks also. Kyera, welcome aboard, and thank you so very much.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to everyone who attended. I'm really looking forward to meeting as many of you in person as possible when the museum opens up. So in the meantime, please visit our website, follow us on social media. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I'm pretty sure it's the Royall House. So yeah, please follow us, and yeah, let's stay in touch.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.